Mario World is considered the most acclaimed Nintendo games ever made. Being one of the very first games to release on this small little console really gave a first impression of what the Super Nintendo can deliver. But most importantly, this was also the game to debut one of the most iconic characters in the Mario series, Yoshi, who was pretty much a big breakout character for Nintendo to the point where he actually got his own little sub-series, with his very first big platformer series being Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island. Now this is another game that received universal acclaim just like Mario World. With its beautiful crayon art style, very fun gameplay, and pretty advanced technology within the cartridge, there is no doubt on why people consider this as one of the best Nintendo games ever made. And after this, Yoshi still continues on having its own standalone adventures, even to this very day with the Nintendo Switch. But for the very next big Yoshi platformer after Yoshi's Island, is when things get a bit interesting. As the very next year after this game release was when Nintendo released the Nintendo 64. And with this, it was pretty much a big generational leap for gaming as we head to full-on 3D. But despite this, Nintendo decided to go for a bit more interesting direction for an N64 Yoshi game, where instead of trying to make a 3D platformer, they decided what the N64 can do with a much more traditional 2D sprite-based game. To basically show that even though that 3D has become the big norm these days, there's still a bit of a market for traditional 2D platformers. Originally this was going to be called Yoshi's Island 64, pretty much a direct follow-up of the original SNES game, but they pretty much had a different gameplay loop and everything to the point where it just became a different entity, so they gave it the title of Yoshi's Story. Which frankly is a much more fitting name. However, when it finally released in 1997, the reception for this game was a lot more mixed compared to the other Nintendo games at the time. Not helping with the fact that, again, this is a direct follow-up of one of the most acclaimed Nintendo games ever made. But despite that, the legacy of this game gets represented a lot over the years. I mean, with the Smash Bros. Series, Yoshi had 2 stages based on Yoshi's story. You have a lot of various nods and different Mario spin-offs, and there was even a stage in Sonic Lost World that was pretty much based off of Yoshi's story. I know the theme and name of this area is called the Yoshi's Island Zone, but come on! This is Yoshi's story. But as for my personal history of this game, this was one of those games I grew up with via the Wii Virtual Console, and honestly, I had a good time playing through it, but I always thought this was a bit more off-putting compared to the other Yoshi games I had at the time. But this was years ago, and I'm very open-minded on what this game is like. Will it be good, bad, who knows, but I'm very curious on how well this game holds up. And for this video, I bought myself the original N64 copy to try it out on that, but if you have a Nintendo Switch Online subscription, it is available on the NSO app. But with everything out of the way, let's get started. So the story of this game begins on Yoshi's Island, home to all the Yoshis. Everything has been very peaceful for the dinos until one day Baby Bowser returns to cast a spell across the entirety of the island, which transforms it into a storybook. And not only that, but he also manages to steal their most valuable artifact, the Super Happy Tree, which basically puts all the Yoshis in an immobile depressional state. With the only few surviving this Yoshmageddon is the 6 baby Yoshi eggs that were recently hatched. And so, with all the adult Yoshis in trouble, it's up to the newly born baby Yoshis to save the day, as they need to travel through different pages of the storybook to stop Baby Bowser, and the only way to do so is to be happy. And now, go. That's basically it. Now, the story of this game is very silly, but frankly very fitting for a Yoshi game. But alright, so for the gameplay. So when you start the game, you are greeted to the world map with 4 different levels to choose from. Which is a bit odd, but I decided to go for the very first level in the game, and you're greeted to a black void with a couple of Yoshis to choose from. Okay, so controls in this game is very similar to Yoshi's Island. Yoshi can still run, jump, and do his trademark flutter jump, as well as eat Shy Guys to create eggs. But this time you can aim a bit more with Yoshi's tongue this time around. And how you throw the eggs is also very different, because instead of having a small reticle that automatically goes up and down like in Yoshi's Island, but in story, Yoshi will stop in place this time so you can aim the eggs a lot more freely. Which, even though it's very different from the last game, works surprisingly well for the level design in this game. Although I've got to say is that actually moving the reticle and Yoshi himself does feel a bit more slippier than the SNES title. Yoshi sometimes just feels like he's just running on ice. Although since this was on the N64 with that very weird joystick, I guess this was intentional to compensate the much more stiffness of that game's controller. But I honestly say you're best off playing with a much more modern controller like on Switch. I mean, hell, with this, it's very easy to do some of the other controls Yoshi can do in this game, like a sniff button that allows him to sneak by. And then there's the unlive button, which allows Yoshi to instantly die. Yes, I'm not kidding, they added a feature in the game where you can kill Yoshi instantly. God dang. But going back to the controls, I feel like for the most part, they're pretty solid and works very well for what kind of game this is going for. As the structure of this game is extremely different from Yoshi's Island, as for each of the levels, there isn't necessarily an endpoint in any of them. This is because Yoshi's story leans a lot more on an exploratory adventure, where in order to progress through the game, you need to get at least 30 fruit in each of the levels. And after you do so, you'll immediately go to the very next page of the game where you can choose even more levels. But if you just go straight on and get all the fruits and go for the next level, you're going to be expecting an adventure that'll most likely last you about 40 minutes max. As Yoshi's story heavily relies on replayability, because throughout the entirety of story mode, you can only play about 6 levels in each of the playthrough. And so once you get to the final area, you can pretty much go back again and try out the other levels you missed out on. And I'll give them credit, the levels in this game are actually pretty fun, as every single level in this game tries something unique from one another. Take the very first batches of levels on page 1, for example. The first level of this game is frankly the most straightforward, as you're pretty much trying to gather up these fruits on a small little plain area. You even meet some little friends like the returning Poochie, or these weird looking egg creatures, who essentially works as checkpoints, but also if you awaken multiple of them, they can teleport you to different parts of the level. But when we head to the third level in this game, we're then platforming on giant clouds, and then the level afterwards, we're climbing on this giant tower with these little propeller things. Every level is like this. Doubly so with page 2 of this game, which frankly is a very funny contrast because in the first page, we're pretty much on this little happy-going plains area. You know, the grassy plains as you expect from Yoshi's Island game. But when we head to the second page of this game, we're then in the hellish-looking caverns, where instead of happy clouds, we're greeted with skeletons, lava creatures, and the sewers. And then the page immediately afterwards, we're then up in the sky and such, full of snowy mountains. And this is the area where we have the main bosses of the game, which are frankly really stupidly easy. I mean, the first boss of this game is literally made out of cotton candy, with the only way to defeat him is Yoshi slowly eating him up, and along the way, you'll refill his health. And this is especially apparent with the final boss in this game, which for the record, it doesn't matter which level you choose for page 6, you'll end up doing the same boss fight for this one. With the boss itself, honestly a very good idea on how you execute it, but what really falls apart is that since this is the lair where the Super Happy Tree is located, you can easily refill all of Yoshi's health with no problem. So with this being said, Yoshi's story frankly has some of the easiest bosses in any Nintendo game ever. Although to be fair, when it comes to like most Mario bosses, especially 2D ones, functionally they're really not something to write home about. So the difficulty kind of relies on basically the levels themselves, and honestly, I feel like the difficulty kind of varies depending on what kind of challenge you want to go through in the game. As I mentioned before, all you need to do to progress through the game is just eat all the fruit. But if you just only go for the fruit, then the variety of levels you have are very low. That's because this game really wants you to try and explore these areas. Because throughout the levels, you'll find yourself with these giant heart collectibles, and when you do it, you can unlock even more levels in the next page. With every level in this game having 3 hearts, and after you collect them all, you can choose all the 4 levels in the next page. And honestly, even though this isn't as hard as collecting all the collectibles in Yoshi's Island, I honestly say this is a good enough incentive to find them. Because you're literally trying to unlock more content within this game by actually playing through the levels, with each of the levels themselves honestly giving a pretty good difficulty curve. But the real challenge within this game is trying to keep all the Yoshis as much as you can, because this is where the live system comes into play. As I mentioned earlier in the video, when you start a run, you can choose any color Yoshi you want. And these little guys are more than just simple recolored skins, because they're actually your live count in this game. As every time a Yoshi loses all of his health, they don't necessarily die, but instead get taken by these little toadies. And so after one gets taken, you have to choose another Yoshi, and if they all die, it's completely game over, as you're completely restarted all the way back to the very first page of the game. With the only way to actually save them is to find these hidden white Shy Guys that will rescue the Yoshi. But these little guys are devilishly hidden, so again, you really need to explore these levels. But regardless on the game's difficulty, I'd say at the end of the day, the level design in this game is honestly very fun to play through. It may not reach the heights of something like Yoshi's Island or Woolly World, but I feel like the game's biggest strength has to be its replayability. As I really don't consider Yoshi's Story as like a proper platformer in terms of progression, more so kind of like an arcade game in a way, where you're basically trying to challenge yourself to get the highest record in each of the runs. In fact, one of the most popular challenges in Yoshi's Story has to be the Only Melon run, as you get a huge bonus if you just collect only melons in each of the levels. In fact, they are so common, they're actually used for a minigame throughout the levels where Yoshi has to do these small little challenges. And when you do them successfully, you're rewarded with a bunch of melons. And finally, only exclusive to certain levels in this game, you can also find a giant Yoshi egg where, if you're able to beat the level with it, you are able to unlock both a black and white Yoshi. But these two Yoshis are probably the hardest things to find in this game, as they're very well hidden and only exclusive to one level each. So it's very best to try and look at every nook and cranny to find— Oh Jesus, what the hell is that? Alright. So I think it's best to talk about the presentation in this game. So honestly, for a pre-rendered N64 title, this game for the most part looks really good for the system. Yoshi games are very known for having very appealing arts and crafts aesthetic, and Yoshi's Story is no exception. I really adore the aesthetic in this game. How every single different environment in this game feels like they were made from different materials. Like how the sky and some of the backgrounds look like they were made out of pants. And I really adore the transitional pop-up book aesthetic they were going for. Everything just feels very lively in these pop-up books, and it's also a really cool callback to the original crayon art style from Yoshi's Island. All of this looks really good, environment-wise, because when it comes to the actual character sprites in this game, it's a bit of a different story. For the Yoshis in this game, they honestly look very good. They're very nice and appealing looking, they're very cutesy, everything you expect from Yoshi. Just whatever you do not look them right in the teeth. But as for the other characters in this game, a lot of them just look straight up weird. And I mean, yeah, you do have your usual Shy Guys, your Lakitus and such. They look alright, but as for some of the new enemies in this game, holy shit, these things are freakish looking. This game is clearly a product of its time, and man, some of these characters really show. This image here is a Chain Chomp, and this image here is my sleep paralysis demon. I mean, hell, even Bowser looks a bit weird in this game. The best way to describe it is how I mentioned him in my Superstar Saga video, where he looks more like a gremlin than Bowser himself. But as for the music in this game, well, obviously this game's not going to be reaching the heights of Yoshi's Island. But despite that, I really do feel like Yoshi's Story has a very good soundtrack. I find it very cool that this started the trend for Yoshi games to have a bit of a leitmotif style to it. And for those who don't know, a leitmotif style is basically a soundtrack that has similar notes to them, but try to change them up to feel very fresh. Similar to something like the Pac-Man World 2 OST, where a lot of the soundtrack in this game have similar notes, but they try something unique for them to feel very fresh. I mean, hell, I even love the title theme music in this game. It could be a bit annoying for some people, but honestly I find it very adorable. But then we have one of the more weirder soundtracks in Nintendo history, like this one where they just straight up have rap music. Yoshi. I kinda like it, but it just feels a bit out of place. Like, you would never expect a song like this to appear in a Yoshi-headed CD. Okay, so to wrap things up for this video, I want to go into details into something interesting about Yoshi's Story. So while Nintendo was developing the Game Boy Advance, they created this small little tech demo which is a somewhat remake of Yoshi's Story. This game was never released, as it's pretty much just showing what the Game Boy Advance could do. A ROM for this demo did eventually leak online, and after playing it, honestly, even though it's very rough around the edges, it's frankly very cool to play something like a prototype of a game that never released. I kinda wish Nintendo did go forward on making a somewhat remake of Yoshi's Story on the GBA, as I feel like a game like this would fit perfectly for a pick-up-and-play style handheld. But yeah, that was Yoshi's Story, and overall, it was frankly a very good time. I had a lot of enjoyment playing through this game. It may not be a Yoshi game I would go back to a lot compared to something like Yoshi's Island or Woolly World, but regardless, I did not regret my time playing through this game. This is not going to be a platformer that's going to truly blow you away or anything, as this game is more so a game just to try and relax to. But I do understand why some people may not be a big fan of this game. Like, some of the aspects here are just straight up of a fever dream, but honestly I feel like there's just a certain charm of Yoshi's story that no other Yoshi game has. If you have a Nintendo Switch Online subscription, then I recommend trying it out. But as for the next video, according to the polls, it looks like we're going to head all the way up to the Nintendo Wii for one of the most divisive Mario Party games in the series. So the next time we'll be here, we'll be talking about Mario Party 9, which is probably the most loved or hated Mario title of all time period. But that'll do for today, so thank you for watching and I'll see you next time. Bye bye!